Today, we'd like to highlight and spend some time talking about perceived motivation as it appears on the Office Discipline Referral Form. What you're looking at right now on the screen is a copy of the SPPS Office Discipline Referral Form, and this is a standardized form that we see in schools across the district. Many of us, I'm sure, have used this form, and it's where we capture information about an event when it happens. So things like time of day, location, type of problem behavior, student name, grade. And one of the required fields on this form is perceived motivation. Many of us might skip over this part, just check unknown, because perhaps we aren't sure what it means, or know for sure how to fill it out and what's being asked of us here. Perceived motivation is something that really is done quickly. It's an educated guess given what is known, and really just is what we're noticing at the time of the behavior and right before the behavior happens. So you can see that the things that are highlighted there really come down to two areas. So in understanding what the function of the motivation of the behavior is, we can really look at two broad categories of either trying to get something. Could be attention, it could be an object, a tangible object, or material in the classroom, or it could be an activity, wanting to get into a part of an activity in a gym class or in recess or in the classroom, or it could be to avoid something, perhaps a challenging task in the classroom, a particular situation, or a person. Something that helps us frame this, understanding the function and the motivation, is that understanding that really all behavior serves a purpose, that we're engaging in a behavior because we're looking for a particular outcome. If we go back to the video, as you might have guessed, the toddler's behavior in the video would likely be to obtain adult attention. So if we take a closer look on the choices on the referral form, under the perceived motivation section, you can see that they're divided up into these two overarching categories: to either obtain something, peer attention, adult attention, or an item, or to avoid something, oftentimes a task or an adult or perhaps peers. Of course, there can be other reasons for motivation of a behavior, and the reason why we're keeping it on the referral form down to obtain and avoid is these tend to be the most common. And for that first perceived motivation, educated guess as to why behavior is happening, we're really just looking initially for trends in the behavior. So let's take a look at an example. A student walking out of the classroom or running out of the classroom. And this is something many of us have experienced. It can be frustrating, it can be worrisome, and sometimes it can feel personal. But when we see this happening, especially repeatedly, we're going to want to really start thinking about the why. Erin walks out of her classroom during math class multiple times per week. Why is Erin engaging in this behavior? We're really looking at starting to get curious about the behavior rather than perhaps judging the behavior. So if we're working with this example of walking out of the classroom, Erin walking out of the classroom, some possible functions for that behavior might be that she's bored in math, not very engaged, and the function would be, you know, walking out of the classroom as a way to avoid having to do the activity. Another possible function is leaving to meet up with some friends in the bathroom who are leaving their class. And perhaps the function of this behavior then would be to obtain peer attention. Or perhaps Erin's walking out of class multiple times during, large group instruction, and she is ending up in the office or the intervention room and getting a lot of time one-on-one with adults. And perhaps here, the function would be to obtain adult attention. All possibilities, but how do we decide which function might fit for this particular behavior? And this is where a simple model called ABC behavior model can often be quite useful for us. This is a model that, as it's titled ABC, actually we don't start with the A, we start with the B here. So in this model, we want to start with a B and really look for what is the student's behavior. So what behavior is it that we're seeing? And starting there, the antecedent is the context where the behavior is most likely to happen. And that's where perhaps an example, an adult example might be helpful, like talking to me at work after I've spent time struggling for hours with an Excel spreadsheet, and you'll likely see a different set of behaviors out of me than when I'm out at a restaurant having dinner with friends and relaxed. So the antecedent is really looking at the setting and the trigger, what's happening right before the behavior that can be helpful to us in understanding the behavior. And lastly, the C is looking at the consequence. And what we mean by this is what happens right after the behavior. Sometimes we might think of, we hear the word consequence and we think of something, a negative consequence, something, related to behavior where the adult imposed a consequence on the student. But here it means the outcome that's most meaningful to the student. So what happens right after the behavior? For instance, Erin's telling a joke in class, and my peers laugh, or her peers laugh, and the consequence is the laughter or the attention, perhaps, in that example. Another way to look at this that's sometimes helpful is to use, sort of a grilling analogy in illustrating the ABC model. So if we think of the fire as the behavior, the lighting fluid is our context, the match is our trigger, what happens right before the behavior, and of course those brats are the consequence, the thing that is most meaningful coming out of grilling. So this can be sometimes a helpful way to understand what the A, B, and the C really mean. So we want to start we really want to start first with that B. Uh, and that's really looking at what's the problem, what's the challenging behavior. And often this can be most helpful to do, especially when it's a repeated behavior. So we want to start by making sure that the behavior and the way that we're thinking about it is observable and measurable. So that the action, the behavior is something that we can see. It's not subjective. And measurable, it can actually be counted or timed. Um, Another way to kind of think about this is how can we talk about the behavior in a way that someone who's not familiar with the student or wasn't there at the time can really recognize the behavior through our description of observable and measurable. And here are just a few examples that that kind of talk a little bit about the difference. And often we might talk about a student being off task, and while that gives us some information, we really want to go back and look at what does off task really mean. So Aaron is up moving around during math class multiple times during math work time is a more precise statement and gives us a little bit better information. So once we've done that and we have the B walking around the room during math time multiple times a week, 3 times a week, then we want to go back and take a closer look at the antecedent. So remembering that the antecedent is the context or the setting right before the behavior happened. And then looking at the C, the consequence. Can we identify what happened right after the behavior or very closely after the behavior that was the most meaningful to the student? And this process often, I think as educators and as parents, we intuitively, do this with maybe not really thinking of it in terms of an A, B, and a C. But it can be helpful to write it down. It also can become something that we do rather quickly without even writing it down. So these are the things that are helpful to think about in working with a challenging behavior. And of course, a few things that are always important to remember, and that is that we first want to make sure that the behavior isn't happening because there's a lagging or missing skill, and or that it's a new context and perhaps the student isn't familiar with knowing how to use that skill in that setting. So really giving that some consideration, as well as, of course, looking at the behavior in the context of cultural, racial, linguistic, developmental issues that may explain a student's behavior, as well as our own interpretation of a behavior that, especially with subjective behaviors, can enter into how we're viewing a challenging behavior. Another piece to keep in mind is, this sometimes feels like a lot when we first hear about it and start working with it, but knowing that all behavior serves a purpose. If we approach a challenging behavior